Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore one of the strangest real estate deals in history. The time an empire decided a territory more than twice the size of Texas was simply not worth the upkeep, and sold it off for about 2 cents an acre. We're talking about Alaska, of course. You are about to be dropped into the middle of the 19th century, into a vast, cold, and profoundly lonely place known as Russian America. Frankly, given the diet and the weather, you probably wouldn't last a week here without developing a very serious appreciation for hot tea. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always fascinating to see where these stories land, so feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments below. For now, though, dim the lights, settle in. Let your mind drift away from the day's concerns. Listen to that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off the ship into the harbor of Novo-Archangelsk, the future Sitka. The air is heavy with the scent of damp spruce, sea salt, and wood smoke. This is the capital of Russian America, and the word capital feels a little optimistic. Before you are a few dozen sturdy log buildings huddled under a perpetually grey sky, all watched over by a large 2-story structure on a hill, grandly named Baranov's Castle. This is the nerve center of the entire colony. Among the settlers are native-born Creoles, children of Russian men and native women, who occupy a space between two worlds, and the ever-present Tlingit people, whose canoes glide silently through the harbor, watching the strange foreign settlement with an air of powerful patience. This entire enterprise is managed by the Russian-American Company, or RACE. Decades ago, it was a thriving business built on one thing: the luxurious pelts of sea otters, a soft gold that fetched incredible prices in China. The company even printed its own currency on pieces of sealskin leather. But by the 1850s, the sea otters have been hunted to near extinction. The profits have vanished, leaving the company and the colony itself financially stranded. The sealskin notes in your pocket feel less like money and more like souvenirs from a bygone era of prosperity. The whole place now feels like a machine that has lost its purpose, running on nothing but old habits and dwindling momentum. Life is a constant struggle against shortages and isolation. A delayed supply ship from Siberia could mean months without fresh flour or sugar. Historians still argue whether Russia truly controlled Alaska or merely occupied a few coastal footholds. Standing here on the muddy main street, it's clear their grip is fragile. This colony is not a thriving piece of the empire. It's a remote, expensive, and lonely imperial headache. It's an asset that costs more to maintain than it could ever hope to generate a drain on a treasury already stretched thin by wars and reforms thousands of miles away. And far across the globe, in the warm, gilded halls of St. Petersburg, the Tsar is beginning to question if it's a headache he wants to keep. The man with this particular headache is not in some damp log cabin in Novo-Arkhanghelsk. You find him thousands of miles away in a world that could not be more different. You're now in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, a sprawling, opulent universe of gilded stucco and polished parquet floors. Here, surrounded by unimaginable luxury, sits Tsar Alexander II, the emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. He looks past the malachite vases and stoic portraits of his ancestors, feeling the weight of a vast, troubled empire on his shoulders. The frozen expanse of Alaska is one of the smaller, yet more irritating burdens in his portfolio. To understand why he would consider selling it, you have to understand him. He is not like his iron-willed father, Nicholas I Alexander, having seen his father's philosophy lead to national ruin, believed Russia's strength must be rebuilt from within. The defeat in the Crimean War was a profound shock. It proved that Russia's massive, serf-based army was no match for the smaller, professional and industrially supplied forces of Britain and France. The Treaty of Paris was a national humiliation, barring Russian warships from the Black Sea. This painful lesson convinced Alexander that Russia must modernize or be picked apart by its rivals. He is thoughtful, sensitive, and deeply aware that his empire is creaking under the strain of its own backwardness. Historians still debate whether Alexander was a true liberal at heart, or a pragmatist who saw reform as the only way to save the autocracy from revolution. His entire focus, his life's great work, is internal. Just a few years ago, in 1861, he enacted the single most monumental reform in Russian history, the emancipation of more than 23 million serfs. Imagine the sheer scale of that undertaking, opposed fiercely by much of the nobility who stood to lose their wealth and influence. It was a social and economic upheaval that reshaped the very foundation of the nation, requiring massive government loans and compensation payments that would strain the Russian budget for decades. This task was so colossal it consumed the government's every resource and all of the Tsar's political capital, leaving little time or energy for distant, unprofitable colonies. Now, place a file on his desk labeled Russian America. Inside, it details a territory with fewer than 1,000 Russian subjects, a native population that is largely hostile, a primary industry that has collapsed, and a yearly cost to the treasury that produces absolutely nothing in return. For a man wrestling with domestic rebellion, military reform, and the liberation of millions, Alaska isn't a romantic colonial outpost. It's a nuisance. It's a leftover project from a bygone era that has no place in his vision for a modern, fiscally responsible Russia. The tangible value of wheat from a single province in Ukraine was infinitely more real than the imagined worth of a frozen wasteland across the world. Therefore, in the cold calculus of statecraft, Alaska was no longer an asset. It was a liability on every front. Militarily, it was a tempting, indefensible prize for the British or Americans. Financially, it was a bleeding wound in a treasury already hemorrhaging gold for reforms. Politically, it was a distraction from the monumental task of rebuilding the very soul of Russia. The sale, then, was not an act of folly or carelessness in Alexander's mind. It was a move of cold, calculated pragmatism, a strategic amputation to save the life of the patient. To truly understand the decision to sell, you have to leave the Tsar's opulent study and travel to a less glamorous but far more anxious part of the government, the Ministry of Finance. Here, there are no malachite vases, only endless shelves. Of heavy leather-bound ledgers, the air smells of dust, old paper, and the faint bitter scent of ink. The men who work here, with their ink-stained fingers and perpetually worried expressions, are the ones who have to find a way to pay for the Tsar's grand ambitions. And their ledgers tell a terrifying story. The Russian Empire, for all its immense size and military might, is functionally bankrupt. The Crimean War didn't just break the army's reputation, it shattered the nation's treasury. To fund the conflict, Russia had taken out enormous loans from banking houses in Paris and Amsterdam, and the interest payments alone were now a crippling annual expense. It was like paying off a gigantic credit card bill where you could only ever afford the minimum payment, watching the principal grow larger each year. The war exposed the fatal weakness of Russia's pre-industrial economy. It simply couldn't generate the tax revenue needed to support a modern state, let alone a modern war. Economists still argue about the precise details of Russia's financial state in the 1850s and 60s, but they all agree on one thing. The empire was living far, far beyond its means. Now, on top of this mountain of existing debt, you have the colossal cost of Alexander's reforms. Freeing 23 million serfs wasn't just a matter of signing a decree. The government had to compensate the nobility for the land they lost, a process that required printing money and taking on even more debt, which in turn led to rampant inflation. The value of the ruble plummeted. Furthermore, the Tsar's push to build railways, the essential arteries for a modern industrial economy, was astronomically expensive. Each mile of track laid across the vast Russian expanse was another river of gold, flowing out of the treasury's already empty vaults. The finance minister, Mikhail von Reuten, was a man tasked with a near impossible job, funding a revolution. From an empty purse, he was forced to implement deeply unpopular measures, like increasing the state tax on vodka, just to keep the government afloat. In this context of extreme, desperate austerity, you can imagine von Reuten flipping through his ledgers and landing on the page for the Russian-American company. It's a small entry compared to the gargantuan costs of the army or the railways, but its number is always negative. Every year, it represents a net loss. There is the cost of ships, the salaries for employees, the supplies to keep Novo-Archangelsk from starving, the pensions for retired officers, and there is virtually no income to offset it. The fur trade is dead. The whaling ventures failed. The attempts to mine coal were unprofitable. For a man desperately trying to plug a dozen holes in a sinking ship, the colony is not a strategic asset. It's another pointless leak. Keeping it is like a family on the brink of foreclosure still, paying monthly fees for a storage unit on the other side of the country, filled with old things they haven't looked at in decades. It's not their biggest expense, but it is, without a doubt, their stupidest. Selling it, therefore, offered two immediate benefits. It would stop the annual financial bleeding, and it would provide a one-time injection of hard currency, gold or silver, not Russia's own depreciating paper money that could be used to pay the interest on a foreign loan or fund another few miles of essential railway. In the cold, hard world of imperial finance, selling Alaska wasn't just an option. It was one of the only sane choices left. The numbers on a ledger can scream, but they can't form a plan. An empire adrift in debt needs more than just accountants. It needs a strategist, a voice from within the inner circle who can point to a clear, if radical, way forward. That voice belonged to the Tsar's own younger brother, the Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich. He is in many ways the complete opposite of the dour, anxious men in the Ministry of Finance. He is energetic, forward-thinking, and the leading champion of the liberal reforms sweeping through the court. As the head of the Imperial Russian Navy, he understands sea power and the realities of global logistics better than anyone. And in the spring of 1857, he drafts a secret memorandum, a document that will fundamentally change the fate of Alaska. Imagine this memo, written on heavy watermarked paper, sealed with the Grand Duke's personal crest, and circulated only among the Tsar and his most trusted advisors, the foreign minister and the finance minister. It is a piece of political dynamite. Selling a piece of the empire, any piece, was an idea that went against centuries of Russian history, which had been a story of relentless expansion. To even suggest it was a risk. But Constantine, with the confidence of a royal brother and the clear-sightedness of a modernizer lays out his argument with devastating logic. Historians debate how much of the memo was Constantine's own unique vision versus how much was simply a brilliant summary of ideas already being whispered by reformers. But its impact was undeniable. First, he attacks the colony on economic grounds. Echoing the grim reports from the finance ministry, he states plainly that the Russian-American company is a failure. The fur trade is exhausted and the company is surviving only on government subsidies, artificial measures, he calls them, that cannot be sustained. He argues that the company is on the verge of total collapse and would require an enormous bailout from the already empty treasury, concluding that the colony is a luxury the empire can no longer afford. Next, speaking with the authority of Russia's Chief Admiral, he lays out the military reality. The colony is indefensible. In the event of a future war with Great Britain, whose naval bases in the Pacific were growing stronger every year, Alaska would be lost within weeks. The Royal Navy could blockade Novo-Archangelsk with ease, and Russia, with its fleet trapped in the Baltic and Black Seas, could do absolutely nothing to stop them. He also raises the uncomfortable prospect of the United States. He sees the Americans' manifest destiny and knows they are hungry for land. It is better, he argues, to sell the territory to a friend and receive payment than to have it seized by an enemy and receive nothing but humiliation. Finally, he frames the sale not as a retreat, but as a strategic pivot. Russia's true future, he insists, lies not in a remote American backwater, but in Asia, specifically the fertile and resource-rich Amur River Valley bordering China. He argues for focusing all of Russia's colonial energy on this new frontier, which was more promising, more valuable, and far easier to defend. Selling Alaska would not only remove a liability, but would also provide a small amount of capital to fund this more important expansion, furthermore strengthening the United States by allowing it to absorb Alaska would create a powerful rival to British influence in the Pacific, a clever geopolitical move that would serve Russia's interests for decades to come. This memo was the catalyst. It transformed the idea of selling Alaska from a quiet, desperate thought in the minds of accountants into a coherent, compelling, and patriotic strategy. It gave Tsar Alexander II the intellectual framework and political cover he needed to turn a radical idea into official policy. Section 5 Grand Duke Constantine's memo was a strategic masterstroke, but it was built on a foundation of commercial failure. To understand the rot at the core of Russian America, you have to look at the strange entity that ran it, the Russian-American Company, or RAC. This was not a normal colonial government. It was a for-profit corporation, a state-sponsored monopoly granted a charter by the Tsar to exploit the territory's resources. In its golden age, it was a titan of commerce. Its chief manager, Alexander Baranov, ruled Alaska like a personal, a fiefdom for nearly 30 years. The company had its own flag, its own currency printed on pieces of sealskin, and its own naval fleet. And all of this power, all of this wealth, came from the pursuit of a single impossibly luxurious commodity, the pelt of the sea otter. You cannot overstate the value of this soft gold. The sea otter has the densest fur of any animal on Earth, a shimmering, velvety pelt that became the ultimate status symbol for Chinese mandarins and wealthy merchants. A single prime pelt, traded in the port of Canton, could be worth more than a Russian worker might earn in a decade. For a time, the supply seemed infinite. The RAC perfected a brutal and terrifyingly efficient system of harvesting this wealth. They didn't do the hunting themselves. Instead, they conscripted entire villages of native Aleut and Alutiiq men, renowned for their skill with kayaks or baidarkas. These hunters were forced into huge flotillas, sometimes hundreds of kayaks strong, and made to paddle into the dangerous open ocean for months at a time, hunting the otters with spears and arrows. It was an ecological catastrophe enacted with ruthless corporate precision. But any business model based on a finite natural resource, harvested without any thought for conservation, is ultimately a suicide mission. The RAC was a victim of its own success. Having hunted the otters to extinction in its own waters, the company pushed its hunting parties further and further south, clashing with the Spanish in California. By the 1840s, the golden age was over. The great hunt was finished. The ships returned to Novo-Arkhanghelsk with pitifully small cargoes. The warehouses that once bulged with tens of thousands of pelts now sat mostly empty. The engine of the entire colonial enterprise had seized. Desperately, the company's directors tried to diversify. They needed a new product. They tried exporting timber and fish, but the shipping costs to any viable market were too high. They invested in whaling, but they were decades behind the expert American whaling fleets out of New Bedford and Nantucket. Their most famous attempt at a pivot was a scheme to sell ice. They would harvest massive blocks of ice from a frozen lake near Kodiak, pack them in sawdust, and ship them south to the booming city of San Francisco, where bar owners and hoteliers in the gold rush frenzy would pay good money for it. For a few years, this quirky business actually turned a small profit, but it was never enough. It was like trying to patch a hole in a battleship with a single piece of chewing gum. Historians still debate if the RAC was doomed by its own short-sighted greed, or if its failure was inevitable. a consequence of operating a European business in a hostile American wilderness. By the time Constantine wrote his memo, the Russian-American company was a zombie corporation. It still had its governor, its flag, and its bureaucracy, but its commercial heart had stopped beating long ago. It was now simply the expensive, inefficient, and money-losing administrative body of a colony that no longer had a reason to exist. It was a drain on the treasury, a relic of a dead industry, and one more powerful argument for cutting the empire's losses and selling the whole frozen mess. The slow internal decay of the Russian-American company was only half of the story. To fully grasp the urgency felt in St. Petersburg, you have to stand on the imaginary ramparts of the governor's castle in Novo-Arkhangelsk, look out at the vast grey expanse of the Pacific Ocean, and feel the deep, unnerving paranoia of being watched. Every unfamiliar sail that appeared on the horizon could be a trader, a whaler, or it could be something far more sinister. Because the Pacific, in the middle of the 19th century, was not a Russian lake. It was rapidly becoming a British one. The decision to sell Alaska was driven as much by fear of a powerful neighbor as it was by financial desperation. This fear was a symptom of a much larger global rivalry known as the Great Game. For much of the century, the British and Russian empires were locked in a Cold War, a chess match of influence, espionage, and proxy conflicts that stretched from the Khanates of Central Asia to the courts of Europe. And Russia had just lost a crucial round. The Crimean War was a fresh, bleeding wound in the national psyche. The Russian army and navy had been comprehensively defeated by the allied forces of Britain and France. That conflict proved that British sea power was not a theoretical advantage. It was a global reality. The Royal Navy could project force anywhere in the world, and there was little Russia could do to stop it. Now, imagine looking at a map from the Tsar's perspective. Immediately to the south of Russian America's ill-defined border was a vast territory controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company, Britain's own powerful, state-like fur-trading monopoly. The relationship between the Russian and British companies was one of intense rivalry, marked by constant disputes over trade and territory. The men of the Hudson's Bay Company were tough, savvy, and had a network of forts and supply lines that were far more robust than Russia's. They were a constant, encroaching presence. Even more threatening was the military installation just a few hundred miles down the coast. At Esquimalt, on Vancouver Island, Britain had established the main naval base for its Pacific Squadron. It was a deep water port that was home to a powerful fleet of modern steam and sail warships. From Esquimalt, the Royal Navy could sail to Novo-Arkhangelsk in a matter of days. The Russian governor knew that in the event of another war, his small, isolated capital would be the first target. He had only a few hundred soldiers and a handful of aging cannons. A single British ship of the line could anchor in the harbour and level the entire town without facing any meaningful resistance. Historians may debate whether Britain ever had serious concrete plans to annex Alaska, but from the anxious viewpoint of St. Petersburg, the threat felt terrifyingly real. This turned Alaska from a simple financial liability into a strategic nightmare. It was a massive, exposed flank in their global competition with Britain. It was a territory they could not supply, could not reinforce, and could not possibly defend. It was an open invitation for a future humiliation. Grand Duke Constantine, as head of the Navy, knew this better than anyone. Why hold on to a worthless piece of land only to have your greatest enemy inevitably take it from you by force? Better to remove the piece from the board entirely. This ever-present shadow of British power looming just over the horizon was perhaps the single most compelling argument for getting rid of Alaska before it was too late. The high-level fears of British warships and empty treasuries were abstract concepts for the average Russian clerk, officer or craftsman living in Novo-Archangelsk. Their reality was shaped by a much more immediate and personal anxiety, the tyranny of distance. The colony was not just isolated, it was on the far side of the planet from its own capital. You are a junior official in the Russian-American company, and you have just used your last spoonful of sugar. There will not be any more until the next supply ship arrives, an event that might be weeks or, more likely, many months away. This single, simple fact governed every aspect of life and made the entire colonial enterprise a logistical nightmare. Consider the journey that a bag of flour or a crate of rifle ammunition had to take to reach you. There were two main routes, each on an epic undertaking. The first was the all-sea route, a journey of nearly 20,000 miles. A ship would leave the port of Kronstadt near St. Petersburg, sail south through the Atlantic, brave the notoriously stormy passage around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, and then begin the colossal trek north through the Pacific. The journey took the better part of a year, and the ship had to survive gales, icebergs, doldrums, and the constant threat of spoiled food and scurvy among the crew. The alternative was the Siberian route, which was scarcely better. Supplies would be hauled overland by horse and cart across the vast frozen expanse of Siberia, a journey of thousands of miles over rough tracks and through dense forests. Eventually, the cargo would reach the dreary port of Okhotsk on the Pacific coast. There, it would be loaded onto a ship for the final treacherous sea voyage across to Alaska, a passage notorious for its dense fogs and violent storms. A letter from your family in Moscow could easily take more than a year to reach you, by which time the news it contained was hopelessly out of date. This lifeline was not just long, it was perilously thin. A single shipwreck or a miscalculation in timing could have catastrophic consequences for the colony. As a result, life in Russian America was a master class in making do. You learned to drink your tea without sugar. You patched your coat until it was more patch than original fabric. You wore boots cobbled together from sealskin because proper. Leather was a luxury reserved for the governor. The diet was a monotonous rotation of dried fish, salted fish, salmon, and whatever game the local hunters could provide. Agricultural historians still debate whether the Russians could have become self-sufficient if they had more fully adopted native foods and techniques. But their attempts to create European-style farms consistently failed. The cool, wet climate and short growing season of coastal Alaska was simply not suited for growing the wheat and barley they were accustomed to. The dream of a self-sustaining agricultural colony remained just that, a dream. This constant grinding struggle for the most basic necessities created a deep psychological weariness, a garrison mentality. The colonists were not proud pioneers taming a new frontier. They were survivors, clinging to a remote outpost, utterly dependent on the annual arrival of a ship that might not come. It fostered a sense of being forgotten, of being a low priority. Project at the very bottom of the empire's list of concerns. This wasn't an empire projecting its power. This was a colony on life support, and the plug could be pulled at any moment. The struggles against bankruptcy, British ambition, and the vastness of the ocean were immense, but they were distant. There was another, more immediate pressure on the Russian colony, a presence that was felt every single day. You are a Russian soldier standing guard on the high wooden stockade that encircles Novo-Archangelsk. You look down from your post, and just beyond the wall you see another town. It is a village of massive clan houses built from huge cedar planks, fronted by immensely tall, intricately carved totem poles that seem to stare back at you with the eyes of eagles, bears, and ravens. This is the home of the Tlingit people, and their presence was the final, insurmountable reason why the Russian-American colony was a failure. The Russians may have built a fort, but they never conquered the land or its people. To the Tlingit, the most powerful and sophisticated indigenous nation of the region, the Russians were simply unwelcome invaders. They had lived in and controlled this territory for thousands of years, with a complex society built around clans, a rich artistic tradition, and a formidable warrior ethos. They were expert traders and shrewd diplomats, and they viewed the Russian settlement not as a capital, but as a trespass. The Russians called them the Koloshi, but they called themselves the Tlingit, the people of the tides. And they never, for one moment, recognized Russian authority. This was not a passive resistance. The history between the two peoples was written in blood. The original Russian settlement, founded in 1799, was destroyed in 1802. In a carefully coordinated attack, Tlingit warriors from several clans united under Chief Catlian, attacking the fort, overwhelming its defenders and burning it to the ground. They proved that Russian control was an illusion. Alexander Baranov only managed to re-establish his fort 2 years later, in 1804, and only with the help of a powerful warship, the Neva, whose cannons could bombard the Tlingit village from the harbor. But even after this victory, the result was not a conquest. It was a stalemate. The new settlement of Novoarkhangelsk was built as a fortress, and for the next 60 years it remained one. The Russians were essentially besieged in their own capital. A high stockade wall separated the Russian town from the Tlingit village just outside. The gate was locked at night. Russians dared not venture into the surrounding forests alone for fear of being ambushed. The relationship was a complex mix of wary trade, mutual suspicion, and outright hostility. The Tlingit were happy to trade for firearms, tools, and blankets, often getting better deals from visiting British and American ships, but they never yielded sovereignty. This constant, low-grade warfare was yet another drain on the colony's resources. It meant the Russian-American company had to maintain an expensive garrison of soldiers. It meant they could never truly expand their settlements or agricultural efforts beyond the range of their cannons. The formidable Tlingit warriors, sometimes wearing striking wooden armor and helmets that could deflect a musket ball, effectively pinned the Russians to a few coastal footholds. They were a permanent, powerful, and unsolved problem. When the men in St. Petersburg looked at the balance sheet for Alaska, they had to add the Tlingit resistance to the long list of liabilities. It was one more compelling reason that this colonial experiment had failed, and one more argument for simply packing up and leaving. The arguments for abandoning Alaska were powerful and numerous. A failing company, an empty treasury, a hostile native population, and the ever-present threat of the British Navy. But there was one final factor that sealed the colony's fate. A development that made the decision not just logical, but obvious. To see it, you must turn your gaze away from the rainy shores of Novoarkhangelsk and look instead at a map of Asia. While the Alaskan venture was slowly dying, a new, far more exciting colonial opportunity was blooming on the other side of the Pacific. Russia was pivoting to Asia, and it needed all of its resources to do it. The focus of this new ambition was a mighty river, the Amur. For centuries, this massive waterway had formed a vague and contested border between the Russian Empire in Siberia and the Chinese Qing Empire in Manchuria. For Russia, the Amur was the ultimate prize. Its valley contained vast stretches of fertile black earth, a stark contrast to the rocky, unfarmable soil of coastal Alaska. This was land that could support millions of Russian peasant farmers, finally, allowing the Russian Far East to feed itself instead of relying on expensive shipments from Europe. Furthermore, controlling the Amur would give Russia a direct year-round waterway to the Pacific, providing a perfect location for a warm-water naval port to project its power in East Asia. The man driving this new eastward push was Nikolai Muravyov, the energetic and fiercely ambitious Governor-General of Eastern Siberia. While the government in St. Petersburg dithered, bound by old treaties with China, Muravyov decided to act. Without official permission, he sponsored a series of expeditions that sailed down the Amur, planting the Russian flag and establishing military outposts along its northern bank. He was a classic man on the spot, presenting the Tsar with a situation that was already a reality. Historians still debate whether this was a brilliant geopolitical masterstroke or simply an opportunistic land grab from a weakened Qing dynasty, which was then crippled by the massive Taiping Rebellion and fighting the British and French in the Second Opium War. Whatever the case, it worked. China was too weak to resist. Through the Treaty of Aigun in 1858 and the Treaty of Beijing in 1860, Russia formally annexed all the territory north of the Amur River and all the land east of the Ussuri River down to the Korean border. It was a colossal acquisition, gained with almost no bloodshed. On this new land, Russia would soon found its great Pacific port, a city whose name meant ruler of the East, Vladivostok. Suddenly, the Tsar had a choice to make. His resources, his settlers, his soldiers, and his attention were all finite. Where should he invest them? Should he continue to pour money into the cold, barren, isolated, and unprofitable dead end of Russian America, a territory that was impossible to defend and produce nothing of value? Or should he focus everything on his spectacular new acquisition? The Amur was fertile. It was strategically vital. It was defensible because it was connected to the rest of Siberia, and it offered a gateway to the immense markets of China and the Pacific. The choice was not difficult. The rise of the Amur project meant the sun had to set on the Alaskan one. Selling the old failed colony to raise a little extra capital for the new, promising one was now the most logical move in the world. Russia had assembled a long and compelling list of reasons to sell its North American colony. But a sale requires two parties, a motivated seller and a willing buyer. and in the 1860s the United States was not in a shopping mood. The nation was exhausted, shattered by a brutal civil war that had cost over 600,000 lives. Its focus was entirely inward, consumed by the immense, painful, and politically fraught process of reconstruction. The national mood was one of healing and isolationism, not expensive foreign adventures. An offer from Russia to sell a vast, frozen wilderness thousands of miles away should have been met with complete indifference. It would have been, were it not for one man. To find the buyer, you must leave the cold palaces of St. Petersburg and travel to the humid, swampy, and deeply ambitious city of Washington, D.C., to the office of the Secretary of State. His name is William Henry Seward. He is one of the giants of American politics, a former governor and senator from New York, who was the leading figure in the new Republican Party. He was so prominent, in fact, that he was Abraham Lincoln's main rival for the presidential nomination. In 1860, after losing, he accepted Lincoln's offer to become Secretary of State, and he was a crucial member of the war cabinet that saved the Union. On the same horrific night that Lincoln was assassinated, Seward himself was brutally attacked in his home by a co-conspirator, surviving despite horrific knife wounds to his face and neck. He is a man who has quite literally been through the fire of his nation's greatest trial. But while the rest of the country looked inward at its wounds, Seward looked outward, at a map of the world. He was a man possessed by a grand, almost fanatical vision of America's future. He believed that the continental United States was just the beginning. The nation's destiny, he argued, was to build a great commercial empire, one that would peacefully dominate global trade. He saw the Pacific Ocean not as a barrier, but as an American lake, and he had a shopping list of territories he believed were essential to controlling it. He wanted to buy Caribbean islands for naval bases. He negotiated to purchase the Danish West Indies. He tried to annex the Dominican Republic. He dreamed of a future where the United States might even peacefully absorb Canada, Mexico, and Central America. Within this grand imperial vision, Alaska was not some peripheral oddity. It was a cornerstone. He called the Aleutian Islands, which stretch from Alaska towards Russia, a drawbridge to Asia, envisioning them as a chain of coaling stations for American steamships that would dominate Pacific trade routes. He also saw the strategic value against Russia's old rival and America's sometimes tense neighbor, Great Britain. Acquiring Alaska would sandwich British Columbia between American territories, squeezing British influence and, in his dreams, eventually compelling them to cede the entire Pacific coast to the United States. Historians debate whether Seward's primary motivation was commercial, strategic, or a simple desire to etch his name into the annals of history. But what is certain is that he saw a potential that no one else did. He was a man completely out of step with the mood of his time. While his colleagues worried about the budget and the complexities of reconstruction, Seward was busy drawing new lines on world maps. He was the one man in America who, when the Russians quietly hinted that their remote colony might be for sale, did not laugh. Instead, his heart leaped. An opportunity he had only dreamed of was about to present itself. The motivated seller was about to meet the ultimate motivated buyer. How could one man like William Seward be so confident in a vision that seemed so out of touch with his time? How could he dream of buying icebergs and polar bear gardens when his nation was exhausted and broke? The answer is that Seward knew he had a powerful, invisible ally on his side, an idea. To understand his audacity, you have to understand the psychological air that Americans breathed in the 19th century. You have to understand the potent and often dangerous concept of manifest destiny. The phrase was coined in 1845 by a journalist named John O'Sullivan, who wrote that it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. It was a simple idea with world-changing power. The belief that the United States was not just a nation, but a divine project, and that God had ordained for it to expand its borders, its democracy, and its way of life across the entire North American continent. It was a fusion of religious mission and nationalistic pride, and it proved to be an almost unstoppable force. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was the driving engine of American history. You can see it in every major expansion of the country's borders. It was the spirit behind the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the nation overnight. It was the justification for the annexation of Texas and the subsequent Mexican-American War, a conflict that ended with the United States seizing a vast territory that would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Manifest destiny was the belief that propelled wagon trains west, the idea that the frontier was not an edge, but a temporary line waiting to be pushed further. Historians debate whether it was a sincere belief in a divine mission or simply a convenient excuse for aggressive conquest, but its effect was the same. It created a national identity deeply intertwined with the idea of constant growth. The Civil War had put a violent, bloody pause on this process. The nation had been forced to turn its expansionist energies inward, fighting itself over its own soul. By 1867, the country was tired. But Seward believed that the spirit of manifest destiny was not dead, merely dormant. He was gambling that he could reawaken it. His vision, however, was a crucial update on the old idea. Traditional manifest destiny was about land, claiming territory for American farmers to settle. It was a continental agricultural vision. Seward's manifest destiny was global and commercial. He was less concerned with claiming land for its own sake and more interested in acquiring strategic points on the map, islands, harbors, and coaling stations that would allow the United States to dominate world trade. He was updating the ideology for a new age of steamships, telegraph cables, and international markets. When he looked at Alaska, he didn't just see empty land. He saw a vital stepping stone to the markets of Asia and a strategic move against the British Empire. He knew the public would initially balk at the price and the apparent uselessness of the territory. But he was counting on this deeper, almost religious belief in America's preordained growth. He believed that in the end, the nation's instinctive desire to expand and fulfill its destiny would overwhelm any short-term practical objections. He was betting on the national myth to overcome the national mood. A motivated seller in St. Petersburg and a motivated buyer in Washington, D.C. are still two men shouting across an ocean. To connect them, you need an intermediary, a diplomat, on the ground who can navigate the treacherous currents of politics and turn a vague imperial wish into a signed treaty. That man was the Russian minister to the United States, Baron Eduard de Stuckel. He was a professional, patient, and deeply experienced diplomat, and his mission was one of exquisite delicacy. You are now at a smoky, gaslit dinner party in a Washington drawing room, watching him work. Stuckel is not Russian by birth, but a Belgian who entered the Tsar's diplomatic service and spent his entire career in the United States. He has been here for nearly 25 years. He speaks flawless, unaccented English, and more importantly, he is married to an American, a wealthy heiress from Massachusetts. This has given him an intimate understanding of American society and politics that no other foreign diplomat possesses. He's a fixture in the capital's high society, a charming and familiar face at every important dinner, reception, and ball. He is a suave, old-world European, and he privately finds the noisy, chaotic nature of American democracy to be rather vulgar, but he is a masterful operator within it. His task is to sell a massive piece of real estate that nobody knows is for sale to a country that has expressed no official interest in buying it. He cannot simply walk into the State Department and announce his intentions. If Russia seems too eager to sell, the Americans will suspect the territory is worthless and the price will plummet. He has to play a long, subtle game. He has to plant the idea, to nurture it, to make the Americans feel that acquiring Alaska is their own brilliant notion. It is less a straightforward negotiation and more a carefully orchestrated seduction. And he knows there is only one man in all of Washington who is susceptible to this seduction, his friend, William Seward. Their friendship was the key that unlocked the entire deal. They were not just diplomatic counterparts. They were genuine social acquaintances who shared a taste for fine wine and late-night card games. This personal connection allowed them to bypass formal protocol. They could have quiet, frank conversations in the corner of a crowded room or over a glass of brandy in Seward's study. Conversations where the true nature of the business could be discussed without creating a diplomatic incident. Historians debate how much of the final success was due to Steckle's skill versus Seward's intense desire to buy. Was the Baron a master negotiator, or just a lucky man who found the world's only enthusiastic customer? The truth is likely a bit of both. Steckle recognized that in the bombastic, ambitious Secretary of State, he had found his perfect mark. He knew Seward's dreams of a Pacific empire, and he knew how to appeal to that vanity and vision. For months and even years, leading up to 1867, Steckle would gently probe and hint, dropping casual remarks about the expense of the colony and its lack of importance to Russia. He was baiting the hook, patiently waiting for his friend with the grand imperial dreams to bite. This was not diplomacy by formal decree. It was diplomacy by quiet conversation, a delicate dance performed by the one man who had a foot in both worlds. The long, slow dance of suggestion and insinuation came to an end in the early spring of 1867. Baron de Stückel, having returned to St. Petersburg for consultations, received his final official instructions directly from the foreign minister, who was acting on the Tsar's authority. The mandate was clear. You are authorized to negotiate the sale of Russian America. The absolute minimum price is $5 million. Proceed with discretion. Armed with this authority, Steckle sailed back across the Atlantic, arriving in New York in February and returning to Washington, D.C. with a singular secret purpose. You are now in the Baron's shoes, feeling the immense weight of this clandestine mission. The city you return to is a political cauldron, boiling with animosity between President Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans in Congress who are determined to impeach him. The air is thick with plots, accusations, and partisan fury. It is the worst possible environment in which to conduct a major piece of international diplomacy. A treaty requires congressional approval, and this Congress is in no mood to cooperate with the President or his cabinet on anything. Secrecy is paramount. If word of the negotiation leaks too early, it will be immediately caught up in the political crossfire and killed for sport. Steckel doesn't go directly to the State Department. He is far too subtle for that. He spends his first few weeks moving through the familiar social circles of the capital, listening to the gossip, gauging the mood, and waiting for the right moment. Finally, in early March, he makes his move. The crucial first conversation does not happen in a formal office, but most likely in the quiet comfort of Seward's private home on Lafayette Square, just across from the White House. Here, the delicate dance begins. Steckel, ever the suave diplomat, does not say, "My master the Tsar wants to sell you his colony." Instead, he carefully probes, framing the issue as a problem he is trying to solve. He explains that the Russian-American company's charter is about to expire, and the government is weighing its options. He might have hinted, with a carefully chosen phrase, that other parties, perhaps the British, had expressed a vague interest, a classic diplomatic bluff to create a sense of urgency. He is watching Seward's face, gauging his reaction. He did not have to wait long. Seward, who had been dreaming of this moment for years, did not hesitate or play coy. He lunged at the opportunity. To Steckel's surprise, the American Secretary of State was even more eager than he had hoped. Seward immediately expressed the United States' strong interest and urged Steckel not to entertain any other offers. He was worried the opportunity would slip away. He told Steckel to formally ask his government for the authority to sell and to name a price. The roles had almost reversed. The buyer was now chasing the seller. This was the green light Steckel had been waiting for. He hurried back to the Russian legation and drafted a secret cable to the foreign minister in St. Petersburg. Thanks to the new transatlantic telegraph cable, a recent technological marvel, his message would arrive in hours instead of weeks. The message was simple. The American Secretary of State is extremely interested. I'm confident we can secure a deal. Please send a formal authorization and your asking price. The secret negotiations had officially begun. The hook was set. With the green light from both governments, the negotiation entered its most critical and clandestine phase. The secret, once shared between two men, now had to be carefully expanded to include the few key political figures whose support was non-negotiable. This was not a public campaign. It was a series of quiet conversations, in private studies over brandy and cigars, in the exclusive clubs and backrooms of the capital. It was the delicate art of building a conspiracy of statecraft, all while the rest of Washington was distracted by the loud, ugly drama of impeachment. Seward knew that his own enthusiasm and the president's approval meant nothing without the consent of the Senate, and in the Senate, one man held the keys to any foreign treaty. You are now a fly on the wall in the office of Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. He is a formidable figure, tall, scholarly, fiercely moralistic, and legendarily arrogant. He is the powerful chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and no treaty can reach the Senate floor without passing through his hands first. He is also a political rival of Seward and despises President Andrew Johnson. Winning his support would be Seward's masterpiece of persuasion. Seward begins his careful lobbying. He doesn't approach Sumner with dry numbers about fish or timber. Instead, he appeals to Sumner's grand intellectual ego. He frames the acquisition of Alaska not as a simple real estate deal, but as a profound geopolitical event. He unrolls maps, showing how the purchase would peacefully extend the glorious domain of American republicanism, a concept dear to Sumner's heart. He speaks of flanking the British Empire, of creating a new American presence in the North Pacific, and of fulfilling the nation's manifest destiny. He is selling Sumner a grand historical legacy, not a frozen piece of land. He's inviting Sumner to be a co-author of a great chapter in the nation's story. While Seward works on the powerful senator, Baron de Stuckel conducts his own shadow campaign. His job is to manage the atmosphere, to ensure that when the news finally breaks, it is met with curiosity, not ridicule. He uses his vast social network, hosting elegant dinners where he can speak privately with influential congressmen and newspaper editors. He doesn't overtly campaign, but he gently corrects misinformation and paints a picture of the deal as a friendly gesture between two great nations. And here, the story enters a murkier realm. For decades, whispers and accusations have swirled that Stuckel used more than just charm and fine wine. It is alleged that he had a secret fund of Russian gold, which he used to grease the wheels. Historians fiercely debate the extent of this bribery. Did he make substantial payments to key congressmen to ensure their votes, or to newspaper editors to guarantee favorable coverage? Or were the payments minor, just gratuities to lobbyists and informants? The truth remains buried in the sealed archives of history, but the legend of Russian bribes adds a tantalizing layer of intrigue to the deal-making. What is certain is that by the time Stuckel received the final price from St. Petersburg, a small but powerful coalition of the willing had been quietly assembled. The public knew nothing, but the most important players were already in on the secret. With the quiet support of key senators seemingly secured, the final piece of the puzzle was the price. In the middle of March 1867, a coded telegraph message arrived for Baron de Stuckel from St. Petersburg. It contained the number he had been waiting for. The Tsar had authorized him to accept a minimum of $5 million, but he was to secure the best price he could. Armed with this flaw, Stuckel went to meet Seward to finally talk about money. You are in the room as these two men who have been dancing around this topic for weeks finally sit down to name the price for a territory 1/5 the size of the entire United States. What is remarkable about the negotiation is how quickly it happened. There were no teams of accountants, no land surveyors, no resource valuation experts. This was not a modern corporate merger. It was a swift, pragmatic conversation between two men who both wanted the same outcome. Stackel likely opened the bidding with a higher figure, perhaps $10 million, to give himself room to maneuver. Seward, just as savvy, would have immediately countered with a lower offer, arguing that he had a difficult political battle ahead to get any appropriation approved by a hostile Congress. They settled on the final figure with astonishing speed, $7,200,000 in gold. The real mystery, which historians still debate, is not that they agreed, but how they landed on such a specific number. There was no clear formula. The famous line that the U.S. was paying 2 cents an acre was a brilliant piece of marketing invented after the fact to make the deal sound like an incredible bargain. It had nothing to do with the negotiation itself. So where did the number come from? One theory suggests it was a kind of informal accounting. Seward may have started with the Russians' absolute minimum of $5 million as a base payment for the territory itself. Then he may have agreed to add another $2 million on top as a symbolic payment to buy out the assets of the Russian-American company. Its aging ships, its log buildings, its trading posts, and to settle its outstanding debts. This would have made the transaction look less like a simple land sale and more like a legitimate corporate buyout, which might be more palatable to Congress. Another, perhaps more likely theory, centers on a last-minute haggle. It's possible that Seward made a simple, clean offer of around $7 million. Stackel, knowing he needed to show his masters in St. Petersburg that he had fought for every last ruble, may have insisted on adding another $200,000 to the total. This small addition, just under 3% of the total price, served no real financial purpose. Its function was purely diplomatic. It allowed Stackel to report back that he had successfully squeezed a little extra out of the Americans, while it was a small enough sum for Seward to readily agree to. It was a face-saving gesture for the Russians, a final tiny flourish on a monumental deal. Whatever the method, the result was the same. A handshake sealed the agreement. For a sum that today would barely buy you a luxury apartment in New York, William Seward had secured a subcontinent, and Baron de Stackel had managed to get his government more than $2 million above their bottom line. Both men felt they had gotten the better end of the deal. The price was agreed upon. The hardest part, it seemed, was over. You are now with Baron de Stackel, on the evening of Friday, March 29th, 1867. He is in his residence at the Russian legation, relaxing after a long week of tense, secret negotiations. His bags are packed for a trip to New York to see his wife's family. The treaty, he assumes, can be formally drafted and signed the following week. It is a time for a quiet sigh of relief, a glass of brandy, and the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. But his relief is about to be interrupted. Late in the evening, a messenger arrives from the Department of State with an urgent summons from Secretary Seward. Stillness quickly gets dressed and walks over to Seward's home, where he finds the Secretary of State pacing with restless energy. Seward is worried. He knows that Congress is scheduled to adjourn soon. He fears that if there is any delay, the window of opportunity will close, opposition will have time to mobilize, and the entire deal could fall apart. He tells Stillness that they cannot wait. The treaty must be written and signed before morning. Stillness, accustomed to the more measured pace of European diplomacy, is taken aback. He suggests they can get their clerks together and handle it the next day. Seward, in a now famous display of his relentless drive, will not hear of it. "Why wait till tomorrow, Mr. Stillness?" he insists. "Let us make the treaty tonight." There is no arguing with Seward when he is in this mode. While some historians see this as a masterful stroke of political urgency, others suggest it may have been slightly theatrical, a performance by Seward to create a sense of unstoppable momentum before any opposition could even get its boots on. Suddenly, the quiet Washington night is filled with frantic activity. Messengers are dispatched across the city, rousing sleepy clerks and translators from their beds. Lights blaze to life in the windows of the Department of State building. Stillness hurries back to his legation to gather his own staff. They all converge on the State Department, where an impromptu all-night working session begins. You can imagine the scene. A long mahogany table littered with papers, reference books, and maps. The air is thick with the smell of gas lamps and brewing coffee as the bleary-eyed clerks get to work. They are not writing from scratch. They use previous treaties as a template, but every word must be perfect. The text is drafted in English and in French, the international language of diplomacy. Lawyers scrutinize every clause, ensuring the articles detailing the rights of Russian citizens who choose to remain in Alaska are clear, and that the mechanics of the property transfer are legally sound. Translators huddle together, debating the precise rendering of legal terms. Seward, a bundle of nervous energy, oversees the whole operation, while Stillness, the patient European, calmly reviews the documents. The work drags on past midnight through the quietest hours of the night. Finally, as the first hints of dawn begin to lighten the sky over Washington, the final copies are ready. At 4 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, March 30th, the room falls silent. William Seward picks up his pen, and beside a pooling blob of dark blue ink signs his name. Baron de Steckel signs beside him. The Great Seal of the United States is affixed with a heavy thud. The secret deal, nurtured for weeks in quiet rooms and back alleys, is now a formal signed treaty. The first, most difficult part of the race is over. You are now William Seward. It is just after 4 o'clock in the morning, and the ink on the treaty is barely dry. The air in the State Department is thick with the smell of stale coffee and burnt-out gas lamps, while the clerks and Baron de Steckel are ready to collapse into their beds. You are buzzing with a manic, triumphant energy. You hold in your hand a document that will change the map of the world. But you know it is still just a piece of paper. A treaty signed by the executive branch has no legal force until it is ratified by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. And you are facing a new, seemingly impossible deadline. The Senate, after a long and bitter session, is scheduled to adjourn for the year today. If the senators go home, the treaty will be left in limbo for many months. This would give the press and the political opposition ample time to pick it apart, to build a campaign against it, and to poison the public mind. The momentum would be lost. The deal would almost certainly die. You know with absolute certainty that this treaty cannot wait. It must be sent to the Senate now. So, without stopping, to rest, you walk out into the chilly pre-dawn air of Washington, get into your carriage, and give your driver an urgent instruction. You are going to the home of Senator Charles Sumner. Your carriage clatters through the empty, silent streets. You arrive at Sumner's brick townhouse on Lafayette Square just as the sky is beginning to show the first pale grey light of dawn. You leap from the carriage, hurry up the steps, and begin knocking on the door. After a few moments, it opens a crack. A sleepy servant peers out, bewildered at this ungodly intrusion. You announce who you are and insist that you must see the senator on urgent state business. The servant, recognizing the Secretary of State, reluctantly shuffles off to wake his master. A few minutes later, Charles Sumner appears at the top of the stairs. He is not the grand, imposing chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He is a man in his nightshirt, roused from a deep sleep, his hair askew, and his face a mask of weary annoyance. He is a man of immense dignity and rigid routine, and he is not accustomed to being woken up before sunrise. He descends the stairs to find you, his political rival, standing in his foyer, flushed with excitement and lack of sleep. "I have a treaty," you announce, holding up the document as if it were a sacred text, "signed with the Russian Empire for the cession of Alaska to the United States." Sumner stares at you, dumbfounded by the news, but his astonishment quickly turns back to irritation. He informs you that it is impossible. The session is ending. There is no time. The senators have already packed their bags. They are tired, and they are in no mood to begin debating a major and completely unexpected international treaty. This is absurd, he might have said. It will have to wait for the next session. He is ready to show you the door and go back to bed. But you are not a man who takes no for an answer. The fate of your grand vision hangs in the balance, here in this quiet hallway, in a pre-dawn clash of wills between a man who wants to go to sleep and a man who refuses to let his dream die. Faced with William Seward's manic, sleepless determination in his own hallway, Senator Charles Sumner finally relents. Annoyed but intrigued and perhaps swayed by Seward's argument that this was a unique moment in history, he agrees to do the impossible. He tells Seward to have the official treaty delivered to the Senate by 10 a.m., and he will call a special executive session of the Senate for noon that very day. The race against time is on. You are now in the Senate chamber. The mood is one of confusion and irritation. Senators who had been planning to catch afternoon trains home are now stuck in their seats, summoned by the president to a mysterious closed-door session. The public galleries are cleared, the heavy doors are locked, and the Secretary of the Senate begins to read the treaty aloud. As the text is revealed, a wave of disbelief, then amusement, and finally outrage ripples through the room. The opposition quickly finds its voice. Senator William Fessenden of Maine, a powerful and respected figure, rises to mock the proposal. What in God's name, he asks, would the United States do with this frozen wilderness? This icebox, this remote and worthless wasteland? Other senators join the chorus. They give the territory a series of derisive nicknames that will echo through history. It is Seward's Folly, a foolish vanity project for the ambitious Secretary of State. It is President Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. They attack the secrecy of the deal, the rushed timeline, and most of all, the cost. The nation, they thunder, is drowning in debt from the Civil War. That $7.2 million should be used to pay soldiers' pensions or rebuild the war-torn South, not be thrown away on rocks, ice, and snow. For a few days, it seems the opposition might have the upper hand. Then, on April 8th, Charles Sumner rises to speak. He has spent the past week in the Library of Congress, devouring every book, map, and report he could find on the territory. He stands before his colleagues not just as a politician, but as a scholar, holding a thick sheaf of notes. He speaks for over 3 hours. It is a masterful, exhaustive, and ultimately decisive oration. He systematically dismantles every argument against the treaty. He speaks of the immense resources, the timber, the coal, the fish, the furs. He emphasizes the strategic importance of friendship with Russia, a key Union supporter during the Civil War. He lays out the geopolitical advantage of removing a European power from the continent and boxing in the British. Crucially, he rebrands the territory. He dismisses the mocking nicknames and argues for using the native Aleut name for the mainland, Alaska, meaning the Great Land. He transforms the image of the place from a frozen wasteland into a land of mystique and immense future potential. He appeals to the senator's sense of history and national destiny, framing the purchase as a necessary and glorious step in the nation's inevitable expansion. Historians debate whether the senators were truly swayed by his arguments or were simply looking for political cover, but the effect was undeniable. Sumner's speech had made it respectable, even patriotic, to vote yes. The next day, April 9th, the Senate votes. The opposition, so loud just a few days before, melts away. The treaty is ratified by an overwhelming margin, 37-2. Against all odds, in the midst of a bitter political war and in the face of widespread ridicule, Seward's secret treaty has cleared its most difficult hurdle. While William Seward and Charles Sumner were maneuvering the Alaska Treaty through the Senate, a much larger political storm was consuming Washington. To fully understand the bizarre context in which this deal took place, you have to look at the man in the White House. You are now an observer in the office of the 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, and he is a man under siege. He is arguably the loneliest and most embattled president in American history. A Southern Democrat who had been loyal to the Union, he was elevated to the presidency by Lincoln's assassination, leaving him a man without a party and without allies. His lenient vision for readmitting the defeated Confederate States into the Union put him on a collision course with the radical Republican majority in Congress, who wanted to punish the South and protect the rights of newly freed African Americans. 1867, this disagreement had escalated into all-out political warfare. Congress was systematically stripping Johnson of his presidential powers, passing laws over his veto. The Tenure of Office Act, for example, prohibited him from firing his own cabinet members without Senate approval. In Washington, the central question was not about territorial expansion. It was about whether Andrew Johnson would even be allowed to finish his term. The talk everywhere was of impeachment. In this deeply toxic atmosphere, the Alaska Purchase played a small but useful role for the embattled president. Johnson himself was not the architect of the deal. Foreign policy was Seward's domain, and Johnson trusted his brilliant Secretary of State implicitly. But while Seward was driven by his grand vision, Johnson's motives for supporting the purchase were far more pragmatic and rooted in his own political survival. Historians debate how much Johnson truly cared about the territory itself, or whether he viewed it almost entirely as a tool in his war against Congress. First and foremost, the treaty was a welcome distraction. Every column inch in a newspaper devoted to the strange purchase of Russian America was an inch not devoted to his latest battle with Congress or the calls for his impeachment. It briefly changed the subject, offering a headline that wasn't about his own political failings. Second, at a time when Congress was trying to render him powerless, successfully negotiating and signing a major international treaty was a way for Johnson to assert his authority. It was a powerful reminder to the country and the world that he was still the President of the United States, capable of acting decisively on the global stage. Finally, it allowed him to cloak himself in patriotism. He could frame the acquisition as a great national triumph, a fulfillment of manifest destiny that rose above the bitter partisan squabbles of the day. It was a chance to look like a statesman, not just a stubborn obstructionist. In the end, the Alaska sideshow did not save him. The House of Representatives would vote to impeach him less than a year later, and he would only be saved from removal from office by a single vote in the Senate. But in a presidency defined by unrelenting political conflict and defeat, the Alaska Purchase was a rare and surprising victory. It was a small piece of good news in a year that otherwise had none, a welcome distraction for a president staring into the abyss. With the treaty ratified by the Senate, the political battle in Washington was won, but the actual transfer of the territory, a vast expanse of land populated by people who had no say in the matter, had yet to take place. The story now moves from the halls of power back to the cold, damp reality of Alaska itself. You are standing on a muddy parade ground in Novo-Arkhanghelsk, which the newly arrived Americans have begun calling by its Tlingit name, Sitka. It is October 18th, 1867. The sky is a familiar shade of leaden gray, and a chilly wind blows in from the sea. Today is the day the flags will change. The ceremony is taking place atop Castle Hill, the rocky promontory where the Russian governor's residence stands. Assembled on the hill are the official representatives of two great empires. For the United States, there is the Commissioner, General Lovell Rousseau, and a contingent of 250 American soldiers, their blue uniforms looking crisp and new in the strange surroundings. For Russia, there is Captain Alexei Peschurov, the Tsar's commissioner, and about 100 of his own soldiers, their green uniforms looking worn and faded. Also present are the Russian residents of the town, including the last governor, Prince Dmitry Maksutov, and his wife. Their faces are a mixture of resignation, sorrow, and deep uncertainty about their future. And then there is the third group of people here today, the people to whom this land has belonged for millennia. The Tlingit are not part of the official ceremony. They have not been invited to participate in the transfer of their ancestral home, but they are watching. They sit in their magnificent canoes in the harbor below, their dark eyes fixed on the proceedings. They stand in silence at the edge of the surrounding forest, powerful and unreadable observers to this strange ritual between two foreign powers. The ceremony begins. The formal proclamation is read aloud, first in English, then in Russian. The words drift over the small crowd, seeming thin and unimportant in the vast wilderness. Then Captain Pesturov gives the order to lower the flag of the Russian Empire, the double-headed eagle that has flown over this hill for more than 60 years. A Russian soldier begins to pull the rope. Eyewitness accounts of the ceremony differ. Some describe it as a dignified, if somber, affair. Others focus on the barely concealed grief of the Russian colonists. The governor's wife, Princess Maksutova, is said to have wept openly as the flag began its descent. The American soldiers stand ready with their own flag, the stars and stripes. It is the official flag of 1867 with 37 stars, not the 50 we know today. They prepare to raise it as soon as the Russian flag is down. A cannon salute is planned to be fired from the American warship USS Ossipee in the harbor and answered by the Russian battery on the shore. It is all meant to be a smooth, symbolic and orderly transition of power. But the flag itself, the very symbol of Russian authority, seems unwilling to cooperate. What should have been a simple, solemn moment is about to become a deeply awkward and faintly comical spectacle. You are watching the 90-foot flagpole, expecting to see the imperial standard of Russia make a slow, dignified descent. A Russian soldier gives a firm pull on the halyard. The flag, a heavy wool banner bearing the double-headed eagle, slides down a few feet and then stops. The soldier pulls again, harder this time. The flag doesn't move. It has become snagged on the rope, hopelessly tangled near the top of the pole, where the wind whips it furiously against the mast. The solemn ceremony grinds to an awkward halt. A murmur runs through the assembled crowd. It is as if the very symbol of Russian authority is refusing to leave, clinging stubbornly to its post. What follows is a few minutes of deeply uncomfortable, almost comical spectacle. The Russian officers bark orders. Several soldiers grab the flagpole and try to shake it, hoping to dislodge the banner, but it's a massive, solid mast and it barely moves. The flag remains stubbornly stuck. The next logical step is for someone to climb the pole. A young Russian soldier, eager to be a hero, tries first. He shimmies a few feet up the smooth, damp wood, loses his grip, and slides back down to a chorus of chuckles from the American ranks. Another tries, and then another. The task is impossible. The formality of the occasion has completely dissolved into a slightly embarrassing farce. Finally, after several minutes of this awkward display, someone has a practical idea. A bosun's chair, a simple plank seat suspended by ropes and pulleys, is fetched from the USS Ossipee anchored in the harbor. A Russian non-commissioned officer straps himself in, and several of his comrades begin to hoist him slowly up the side of the flagpole, like a sack of flour being lifted into a loft. The crowd watches in silence as he makes his slow, dangling ascent. When he finally reaches the top, he untangles the flag from the halyard. But now he has a new problem. He is clinging to a flagpole 90 feet in the air, with a massive, heavy flag in one hand. There is no easy way to reattach it, so it can be lowered respectfully. So, he does the only practical thing he can think of. He simply unhooks it and lets it drop. The heavy wool banner, the symbol of 60 years of Russian rule, flutters down from the sky. It drifts on the wind, sailing directly over the heads of the Russian delegation and towards the honor guard of Russian soldiers assembled at the base of the pole. And in a final, almost unbelievable moment of symbolic indignity, the falling flag lands directly upon the upturned bayonets of the Russian infantrymen. There are differing accounts of this moment. Some say a soldier caught it, others that it was pierced by the blades. But the story that immediately took hold was the one of the flag being caught on the bayonets of its own soldiers. At the sight of this, of the imperial standard being unceremoniously dropped and caught like a piece of laundry, it is said that Princess Maksutova, the governor's wife, fainted. With the Russian flag finally, messily down, the ceremony is quickly put back on track. The American soldiers raise the stars and stripes, the cannons fire their salutes, and the transfer is declared complete. But the strange, flawed, and deeply human spectacle of the stuck flag has already defined the day. It was a fittingly awkward end to an awkward colonial chapter. While the Russian and American delegations were navigating the awkward ceremony in Sitka, the news of the purchase was finally spreading across the United States. For months, the treaty had been a closely guarded secret, known only to a handful of politicians and diplomats. Now, the story was splashed across the front pages of newspapers from New York to San Francisco, and you are an American citizen in 1867 picking up your morning paper and reading the headline with a sense of utter bewilderment. Russia has sold us what? For how much? The overwhelming public reaction was not one of patriotic pride, but of deep skepticism and widespread ridicule. The nation's newspaper editors, who had been largely kept in the dark, unleashed a torrent of mockery. They saw the purchase as the bizarre pet project of an out-of-touch Secretary of State, and they competed to coin the most memorable and insulting nicknames for the new territory. The New York Tribune, run by Seward's fierce political rival Horace Greeley, led the charge. It was Greeley's paper that popularized the most famous and enduring name for the acquisition, Seward's Folly. The name was perfect. It was catchy, alliterative, and perfectly captured the public sentiment that the deal was a colossal and foolish blunder. Other papers eagerly joined in. The new territory was called Seward's Icebox, a place fit only for storing frozen goods. It was Johnson's polar bear garden, a jab at the unpopular president. Some wordsmiths got more creative, dubbing it Walrussia. The critics painted a grim picture. They claimed Russia had swindled the United States, selling it a sucked orange, a territory whose only valuable resource, the sea otter, had already been hunted to extinction. Political cartoonists had a field day. They drew Seward as a foolish shopper with an empty wallet, happily receiving a giant, dripping block of ice from a grinning czar. Another popular cartoon showed President Johnson and Seward dressed as old, women cleaning house and using a broom to sweep unwanted rubbish, labeled Alaska, out the door and under the rug of the American map. The arguments against the purchase were simple and resonated with a public still weary from the Civil War. First, the cost. At a time when the nation was struggling with immense war debt, spending $7.2 million on a frozen wilderness seemed insane. That money, critics argued, could pave roads, build schools, or help pay the pensions of Union veterans. Second, the land itself was perceived as utterly worthless. The popular imagination pictured it as a land of eternal ice and snow, with no resources worth exploiting. Why, they asked, would we buy territory that no American would ever want to live in? Some historians point out that this criticism was sharpest in the Northeast, while newspapers on the Pacific coast, closer to the new territory, were often more optimistic about its potential for trade and fishing. But those voices of support were largely drowned out by the national chorus of ridicule. William Seward had won the secret political battle inside the halls of Congress, but he had spectacularly lost the public relations war. He had secured his treaty, but he had failed to convince his countrymen of its wisdom. The popular verdict was in, and it was damning. In the eyes of most Americans, the acquisition of this vast, mysterious northern land was, and would long remain, Seward's great folly. The treaty was signed, ratified, and the American flag was flying, however awkwardly, over Sitka. But one crucial step remained, and it would trigger a final, bitter political battle. A treaty can be approved by the Senate, but according to the U.S. Constitution, all federal spending must originate in the House of Representatives. The Senate had approved the purchase, but William Seward still didn't have the cash. And the House, dominated by his political enemies, was in no hurry to give it to him. For more than a year after the treaty was ratified, the $7.2 million payment remained stalled, a hostage in the ongoing war between Congress and the President. You are now in the chamber of the House of Representatives in the spring of 1868. The public ridicule of Seward's folly has empowered the opposition. Congressmen rise to denounce the deal, arguing that the country is not legally bound to pay for a treaty they consider to be a swindle. They are using the appropriation bill as another weapon with which to attack the administration. For Baron de Stillness, this period was a diplomatic nightmare. His country had already handed over the territory, but the payment was nowhere in sight. He was forced to once again engage in frantic behind-the-scenes lobbying, prowling the halls of the Capitol and hosting dinners to persuade reluctant congressmen. It is during this period that the allegations of bribery are most intense, with Steckel desperate to unlock the funds. Finally, in July of 1868, after more than a year of obstruction, the appropriation bill passed. The payment was approved. The saga was finally over. But the controversial nature of the deal gave rise to a host of myths and legends about the payment itself, legends that have persisted to this day. The reality of the payment was far more mundane than the myths. There was no ship laden with gold bullion that later sank in a storm, taking the Russian payment with it. Instead, on August 1st, 1868, the United States Treasury issued a warrant for $7,200,000 payable to Baron de Steckel. You can imagine this document, an ornate, oversized check. Steckel endorsed this warrant, and instead of trying to ship gold, he deposited it at Riggs Bank, a prominent private bank in Washington, D.C. From there, the magic of 19th century international finance took over. Steckel instructed Riggs Bank to transfer the funds to the London branch of his preferred bank. The money moved not as physical gold, but as a credit, an entry in a ledger. Once the funds were in London, the world's financial capital, the majority was used to buy British government bonds or converted into gold bullion to be transferred to the Russian government. The myth that Russia never saw the money is also false. The bulk of the funds did eventually make their way to the Tsar's treasury. However, there is a kernel of truth to the stories of shady dealings. Steckel's own records show that he didn't transfer the full amount. He paid out at least $165,000, a fortune at the time, in expenses. This included a $25,000 payment to himself as a personal bonus, and tens of thousands more in payments to lobbyists, lawyers, and allegedly several key congressmen and newspaper editors who had helped secure the passage of the appropriation bill. So while the story of the sunken ship is a fable, the story of the final payment is still tangled in the murky reality of corruption and backroom deal-making. For nearly 2 decades after the purchase, it seemed as though the critics had been right all along. The territory of Alaska was a vast, quiet, and largely ignored part of the United States. It was not a state, not even a proper, organized territory. It was simply the Department of Alaska, administered first by the Army, then the Treasury, then the Navy, all of whom seemed to have little interest in it. The Russian population dwindled as most colonists returned home, and only a trickle of American settlers arrived to replace them. The great land sat in a kind of limbo, and the name Seward's Folly seemed more accurate than ever. But deep in the wilderness, far from the eyes of politicians and newspaper editors, a new kind of person was arriving. You are no longer a diplomat or a soldier. You are a prospector. You are a tough, bearded man with calloused hands, a stubborn glint in your eye, and a belief that fortune lies hidden in the earth. You carry a pickaxe, a shovel, and a simple metal pan. Drawn by rumors and a relentless sense of hope, you and men like you begin to explore the creeks and valleys that the Russians, in their focus on sea otters, had never bothered with. And you begin to find what you are looking for. There is a historical debate about how much the Russians really knew about gold in Alaska. Some scattered reports suggest they were aware of its presence, but either lacked the means to mine it, or perhaps more likely, deliberately kept the discoveries quiet, fearing a chaotic gold rush they could not possibly control. But the American prospectors had no such reservations. They were here for one reason only. First, there were small strikes near Sitka, then more promising finds in the Stickeen River region. These were just trickles, enough to keep the rumors alive. The first great turning point came in 1880. 2 prospectors, a Canadian named Joe Juno and an Irishman named Richard Harris, were searching for gold in the Gastineau Channel. They had little success until they sought the guidance of a local Tlingit leader, Chief Cowie. The chief, drawing on his people's deep ancestral knowledge of the land, guided them to the mouth of what is now called Gold Creek. There, in the bottom of their pans, Juno and Harris found not just flakes, but nuggets. They had discovered the Silverbow Basin, one of the richest gold deposits in the world. This was no small trickle. A new gold rush was on. A rough-and-tumble mining camp sprang up almost overnight, a chaotic town of tents, log cabins, and saloons. The camp soon became the first major American town founded in Alaska, and it was named after one of its discoverers, Juneau. The news of the Juneau strike electrified the West Coast. Suddenly, the headlines that had once mocked the icebox were now shouting about Alaskan gold. This was not yet the world-famous Klondike gold rush that was still more than a decade away. But it was the beginning of the end for Seward's folly. The purchase was no longer a total financial loss. The value of the gold extracted from the Juneau district alone would eventually dwarf the $7.2 million purchase price many times over. The icebox, it turned out, had a golden lining. The full vindication of William Seward was yet to come, but the first undeniable proof of his foresight was now being pulled from the icy streams of his great northern land. The discovery of gold at Juneau was only the beginning, a quiet prelude to the symphony of wealth that Alaska would eventually become. In 1896, news of a massive gold strike on the Klondike River in Canada's nearby Yukon Territory electrified the world. To reach the Klondike, tens of thousands of prospectors had to travel through Alaska, transforming it overnight. This single event, the Klondike Gold Rush, forever destroyed the narrative of Seward's folly. The initial $7.2 million investment seemed like a pittance in the face of the billions of dollars in economic activity the rush generated. The icebox had become a treasure chest, and the gold was only the beginning of the story. Over the next century, the true, almost incalculable value of Alaska was revealed in layers. Its waters held one of the richest fisheries on the planet, a sustainable resource that has fed millions. Its vast forests provided timber. Its mountains yielded huge deposits of copper, silver, and zinc. And then, in 1968, came the discovery that would dwarf even the gold rushes. Oil. The massive Prudhoe Bay oil field on Alaska's North Slope turned out to be the largest reserve of petroleum in North America. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, an engineering marvel snaking 800 miles across the wilderness, was built to carry this black gold to market, generating hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. And yet, the economic return was perhaps only half of the deal's true worth. William Seward's strategic vision proved to be uncannily prescient. During World War II, Alaska was a vital strategic anchor, the site of the forgotten Aleutian Islands campaign, and a crucial transfer point for planes and supplies being sent to the Soviet Union to help fight the Axis powers. And during the long, tense decades of the Cold War, Alaska's value was simply immeasurable. It became America's watchtower on top of the world. Its position, directly across the Bering Strait from the Soviet Union, made it the front line of North America's defense, home to early warning radar stations, fighter jet bases, and secret. Listening posts. The folly had become the fortress. So the story of the sale of Alaska comes to its quiet conclusion. The frantic energy of Seward's all-night session has long since faded into the stillness of the historical record, and the echoes of the senator's angry debates have been silenced by the immense deep quiet of the Alaskan wilderness itself. The worries of Tsar Alexander II and Baron de Sturkel are now just footnotes in a story with a surprising and fortunate end. The land remains, indifferent to the papers that were signed or the money that was exchanged. The great snowy mountains continue to watch over the silent forests, and the northern lights still dance in the cold, clear winter sky, just as they always have. All the frantic arguments and human ambitions that once swirled around this great land have settled now, like soft snow drifting down upon a quiet landscape. There is nothing left to argue about, nothing left to prove. The deal is done, the story is over, and now it is time to rest, time to let the silence of the great land fill your thoughts, and to let your own mind drift into the quiet, peaceful territory of sleep.